All right, we are headed toward a new unit, the Civil War and Reconstruction down the road. So we're going to go ahead and get started talking about the causes of the Civil War. And there are five main causes that we're going to be talking about to discuss this, how this ended up in Civil War. And as you guys know, we've been headed toward this since the very beginning. Way back in 1776, as we talked about with the writing of the Declaration of Independence, there initially was a slavery clause that Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Constitution, or sorry, into the Declaration of Independence, as you recall. And they felt that they had no other choice than to remove that. And remember what the slavery clause said, which was it basically condemned slavery and the practice of slavery. So that would have paved the way for abolishing slavery even before or as we were becoming a brand new country. But unfortunately, at the time, the Southern colonies, remember, at that second second Continental Congress, they refused to sign the Declaration with that slavery clause intact. So the founding fathers felt that they had no option but to go ahead and remove that. So we knew we were headed for a battle over slavery from the very get-go, but we had obviously hoped that it wouldn't result in civil war. I want to start by sharing with you some numbers, because these numbers tell the story. These numbers explain why the South would never have let go of slavery without a fight, literally a civil war. Um, here are the numbers that I want to share. The number of slaves in the year 1800. So we haven't been a country for very long. We had 800,000 slaves in the United States, the majority obviously in the South. By 1860, that number was 4 million in 60 years. And that is not by chance. That is because something very specific occurred between the years of 1800 and 1860 that propelled the number of slaves to increase. And that thing is the cotton gin. And it actually happened just prior to 1800. So in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, thinking he's just inventing this great new product that's going to make life a little bit easier, like we think about so many things that we invent. But unfortunately, it exploded cotton in this country, hence the number of slaves. So in 1790, so just before the cotton gin and just before that 1800 number I gave you about 800,000 slaves, in 1790, there were 3,135 bales of cotton produced by our entire country. That's it. So next to, non-existent, meaningless to our economy. And then in 1820, and now the cotton gin has been invented for about 20 years, 334,378 bales of cotton. So a significant increase, but that ain't nothing. Then we look at 1860 again. And by the way, 1860 is relevant because that's the eve of Civil War. So there's 4 million slaves in this country by 1860. And again, those by 1860, it is in the South. But then to compare that post-cotton gin, 1860, the same year, 4.8 million bales of cotton. So we went from 3,000 to 4.8 million in 70 years. And the population of slaves, the number of slaves in this country went right along with it. Slaves to cotton went hand in hand. So the South was never going to let go of that profit without a fight, like I said. Okay, so we'll start with the things that divided the North and the South and led to civil war. And obviously, number one is slavery. So the North had been against it from the get-go, although as we also talked about, they were a bit hypocritical because they were still profiting from it. They were building ships, they were sailing ships, they were the auctioneers. They did profit from the practice of slavery, but they didn't keep slaves. So they were very much against it. And that increased as we marched through time. In our last unit, some of you took the abolitionism term as your term for the story map. And so there were groups of people working toward the abolition of slavery from the beginning of our country. And that movement continued to gain speed and numbers. But again, if we go back to slavery, the Southerners wanted to hold on to this. Absolutely. It was everything to their economy, they believed, and they also argued that it was their way of life. To them, it's part of their culture. It's who they are. So how can you criticize us or judge us? It's our culture. It's how we live our lives. That's what they believed. So that again, regarding the economy, the Southern economy, was just foundational in their minds. They couldn't let it go. All right, second thing that was a dividing issue for them was, again, back to our last unit, westward expansion. So westward expansion, as we talked about in the last unit, we start as 13 colonies, we head over the Appalachian Mountains, we eventually get all the way to the Mississippi, we keep going. Westward expansion manifests destiny, that we believe that we are destined by God to take over this land. And so we systematically do that. So we talked last unit about the impact of that idea on Native American tribes, on Native American people, the destruction, the decimation of a people and their culture. But that wasn't the only issue of westward expansion that was a problem. It was also back to this issue of slavery. So as we populated and continued to expand westward, the question was always, well, what kind of state is that going to be? As they applied for statehood, is it going to be a free state or a slave state? So we repeatedly came up with compromises, Henry Clay being our biggest compromiser. So we just continue to put Band-Aids over the issue. So right from the get-go, like we talked about, 1776, we put a Band-Aid on the issue. We knew slavery was this, thing that was dividing us from the very beginning, but we just pushed it, to the future to deal with, because they believed, handle everything at once. But it keeps coming back. So the Missouri Compromise being the first of those compromises, again, the 3630 line of latitude that they said in this compromise. So this is a document of our government saying, okay, north of this line, free, no slaves. So south of this line, they would allow it. So they acknowledged slavery. Our government was acknowledging slavery, thereby allowing slavery. In the northern, just a bit of difference in terms of the populations of the existing states. In the north, primarily, it's immigrants that are coming in and expanding and increasing the population. And the north is also much more industrialized. So their population is expanding, giving them more political power. In the south, they're agricultural as opposed to industrial like the north. So they are, again, buying slaves, keeping slaves, but remember that 3/5 compromise. So they count on also not only the slaves to do all the work, but also as counting them as part of their population to increase their political power. So they have to constantly watch this balance of power as territories want to become states, because neither side wants the other one to gain the upper hand. Is it going to be a free state? Is it going to be a slave state? They have to balance the power, because they worry, both sides worry, if the free states have the upper hand, they're going to abolish slavery. And the southern states, flip side, if the southern states get more slave states, then they could, just continue this into perpetuity. All right. Next issue that was dividing them was about tariffs. And just as I talked about a second ago, that the North was so industrialized, the South was agricultural. That's how they ran their economies. And so Southerners were very much dependent on imports. And our national government decided to begin to highly tax, which is a tariff, remember, a tax on an import. So they began to increase those taxes on imports. And it helped the Northerners because products were made in the North and they would buy their products more locally. But Southerners relied on European products, which are then imports. And so those cost them more. So the tariffs were hurting the Southern economy while they were helping the northern economy. So there's this divide between the two. The Southerners want to see those tariffs get reduced, and the Northerners like the tariffs because it's helping to protect what they produce. So that's a compromise of 1833, once again, Henry Clay. And they really did have a legitimate beef. At one point, we had our tariffs at 63%. That's insane. Think of what tax rates are. 63%, when you add that onto the cost of goods, is horrific. And they actually threatened to secede. South Carolina, always leading the way, right? Even way back in 1776, they're still leading the way here. They were the first to secede, actually. Fast forward a bit. So South Carolina, with those tariffs, threatened to secede in 1833. And they called these tariffs that were passed a tariff of abominations, like abominable snowman. So they hated these tariffs. So again, we were marching towards civil war about tariffs at that point, but Henry Clay put a Band-Aid on it, pushed it off for the future. Okay, one more issue, states' rights versus federal power. If we go back again to the constitutional era where we added those Bill of Rights, we had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists wanting to hold on to states' rights, autonomy, that we have the right to do what we want within our state. And so they believed that slavery was one of those things. They had the right to practice slavery, and the federal government shouldn't have any say in it whatsoever. So historically, that had been true. They had the Constitution, the Bill of Rights kind of on their side. And that they also argued that they had the right to secede if the federal government was being unreasonable or harming them, abusing their power and hurting their economy and culture. So they believed they had the right to secede. Okay, last thing, which I already touched on, maintaining political power in Congress between slave states and free states. So that all comes back to, when we say Congress, that's both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it does impact both. Remember that in the Senate, which is the upper house, there's 2 senators per state. Well, if there were more slave states, suddenly they would have more power in the Senate. And if there were more free states, if they admitted more free states, they'd have more power in the Senate. So they don't want that to occur. But then the lower house, the House of Representatives, that's based on population. So once again, these numbers, how many people live per state, and is it a free state or is it a slave state? So they have to be constantly careful when they are admitting states into the Union that they are maintaining this balance of power. Like, fast forward to the end, the Civil War, once we fought it, and as we said, we've been waiting for this battle since the beginning, we have more casualties than all other wars combined, which makes sense, right? We're fighting ourselves, Americans against Americans. So there were 620,000 dead in 4 years. So from 1861 to 1865. That's a great cost to our nation. But the other side of that is that 4 million former slaves were now free people. And we head into Reconstruction, which we'll talk about down the road. One other quick thing, just what sparked it. If we go back, oh yeah, I do want to talk about this. What sparked it? What finally was the powder keg, or the wound or the injury or something that we couldn't put the Band-Aid on? It was too much. And it was the election of 1860, which is when Lincoln was elected. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot of the majority of the southern states. That's how much they didn't want Lincoln to be elected. So Lincoln at the time was the Republican Party, and the southern states were the majority were Democrats. That's not the same as today. That party's actually completely did a 180. So it's not the same as today. So don't think of it when you think about Republican and Democrat the way that we do now. Entirely different. But basically, the Democratic Party in the South, which was predominantly in the South, they split their votes. So we talked about back in our government unit, like a third party can sometimes sway an election because they steal votes from other people. So that's kind of what happened with this 1860 election. And then there was a fourth party, but he didn't get too many votes at all. But the Democratic Party, there was a Democratic candidate in the South, there was a Democratic candidate in the North. Stephen Douglas, you may have heard of him before, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, rather famous. So Stephen Douglas was the Northern Democrat. All right, and then there was a Southern Democrat, John Breckinridge. So Abraham Lincoln did not even get the majority of the votes. 60% were not for him, but 40% he had the biggest majority. So he became the president. And promptly after he was elected, even before he was inaugurated, South Carolina left the Union. And they were followed very quickly by many more, 11 in total. So the actual war began when the Southerners fired on Fort Sumter, and that's what sparked it. And Lincoln had to take action. It was a federal fort, and he had to take action at that point. So there we have it. We're ready to begin our Civil War unit. Thank you.